up. Throw down the strong box. Come on, hurry up or I'll blow your head off.
Telescope 67.
Welcome to Telescope 67. This week we're joining the colorful celebrations of Canada's 100th birthday with a special cycle of centennial programs, all in color and all about Canada. Throughout the year we're going to be staying home, where we hang our hearts, and traveling to all points on the Canadian compass. Some familiar, some unexplored, while we meet our fellow citizens and count our blessings. We're going to look back at our past, eyes front to the present, and a long view forward to our prospects in the future. Tonight, we're starting where the land comes to an end on the brink of the Pacific. We're saddling up with folk singer Ian Tyson as he returns to his native province in his earlier years as a rodeo rider to reenact the day of the desperado in 19th century British Columbia. Here in the far west, we had our own Jesse Jameses and Wyatt Earps, true sons of the frontier who rode before they could walk and learned to shoot before they could use a knife and fork. Among the outlaws in focus on Telescope 67 are Sam Rowlands, who held up the Caribou stage a few moments ago, the hell-raising McLean brothers, train robber Bill Miner, and the Russian bank busters of New Hazelton. From stagecoach to gunfight, blending folk song and frontier fact, Ian Tyson and writer-director Robert Barclay take us back with a rueful smile to the dusty trails of wild days in a wild land. The Bad Men of BC in just 1 minute.
Some of the Bad Men of BC came in the wake of the early explorers when they joined up with the Hudson's Bay and Northwest companies looking for a life of excitement and adventure. The only trouble was that their ideas on excitement were not always legal. When it was discovered that there was gold in these steep hills of British Columbia, there was a population explosion that could be heard the world over. Men of every description poured into the Caribou looking for gold. There were big ones and small ones, tough ones and shy ones. Names like Dirty-Faced Pete, French Frank, Dancing Bill, Bloody Edwards, and Whoop-Up Jake. Not too many of them could afford to drive in the stagecoach like this. Most of them had to walk in with everything they owned on their backs, often the greatest gamble of their lives. All along the old Caribou Trail, little gold rush towns like Barkerville started to spring up. And within a few years, there were 10,000 people living here, and it was the biggest city west of Chicago and north of San Francisco. You know, Vancouver didn't even exist in those days, and had it existed, well, the local folks here wouldn't have given it much of a chance to amount to anything, because it was too far away from the action. That is, it was 400 miles away from Barkerville. The coming of the railway meant a lot of changes for BC. Mainly it meant an end to the long isolation from the other colonies of British North America. And it also meant that things were going to have to move just a little bit faster out here. For the outlaws, the coming of the railway was something that was worth all the risk. Because in the baggage car of a train, you can carry a lot more gold than on a stagecoach. It wasn't that long ago either. Most of the headstones of the young men buried here are not over 100 years old. And the stories of the truly colorful Bad Men of BC, why they were going on right while Barkerville here was in its heyday. And these young men that are buried here on the site of one of the richest gold strikes in the history of the Caribou, they're the young men that could tell you all about it. They could tell you about the man who pulled the biggest stagecoach robbery in Canada's history. Sam Rowlands. Sam found that the holdup was the easiest part. The big problem, apart from the flies, was how to get the $12,000 in gold dust and nuggets out of the country.
Say, what about, maybe, yeah. If I mine it out, who can stop me from taking it out of the country? Yeah. Oh, Sam, you're a clever one. Hey, wait a minute. Wait for Sam. Wait. Oh, well, just needs to have the bugs ironed out, that's all. It'll work fine. It'll work fine. After a couple of weeks of heavy mining, Sam couldn't resist the saloon, and he made the mistake of paying for his drinks with nuggets. Now, the boys knew that Sam had staked a claim, but until they saw the gold, nobody had much faith in it. Ooh, distilled in an old gumboot. Even a classic hangover couldn't keep Sam away from his claim the next morning. But on the way, he got the distinct feeling that he wasn't alone. Can't be the DTs. Gotta be my imagination. You vultures. I'll be out of here in a couple days anyway. The happy day finally came, and Sam went to the bank to draw out his hard-won gold. He hired a stage to take him across the border and out of the country. No, thanks. I'll carry it. It's just my toothbrush and my string tie, a few things like that. Oh. The trouble was that the provincial police had checked his gold when it was in the bank, and found out that it couldn't possibly have come out of one claim. There were about 40 different kinds of gold in his single haul, and they nabbed him just as he was getting out of town. In British Columbia, like any other place, crime doesn't pay. At least it didn't for poor old Sam Rowlands. He was convicted on what we would call today circumstantial evidence, and was given 7 years in the penitentiary for his clever little scheme. Now, the McLean boys, they were bad men of a different kind. They were outlaws in the same sense that you'd call a bad, psychotic horse an outlaw. And they went on a murderous rampage down through the Nicola Valley. It gave me the material for a folk song which I wrote, about 5 years ago. I call it Four Rode By. The trouble really began in 1820, when Donald McLean came out from his home in Tobermory, Scotland, to work for the Hudson's Bay Company. For 40 years, Donald McLean was a law unto himself in the Kamloops area. And when he was finally murdered by the survivor of a family he had massacred in cold blood, no charges were ever brought against his killer. Sophie, his second Indian wife, was the daughter of Chief Louis of the Kamloops Band. She had 3 sons by Donald McLean: Alan, the eldest and leader, Charlie, and young Archie, who was always trying to prove to his older brothers that he was as tough and as wild as they were. Growing up in the shadow of their reckless father, the boys formed a band and began rampaging through the valley with their young friend Alex Hare. One cold December night, they stole a prized black stallion from a rancher called Palmer. Palmer went out with the local police constable and 2 other men to get the horse back. About 16 miles from Kamloops, on the old Nicola Indian Trail, they spotted the boys' horses in a clearing, but there was no sign of the wild McLeans. A shot rang out and scattered the unarmed posse. Were the boys serious? Well, Constable Usher didn't think so, and he went in after them as he had done many times before.
But this time there was none of the defiant shouting and wild bravado that he had come to expect from them. This time there was nothing at all, just an ominous silence. Suddenly, 15-year-old Alex Hare jumped the constable and knifed him, and 14-year-old Archie McLean finished him off with a shot in the head. The McLean boys had been hell-raising for years. This time, they were raising hell. Their next victim was an old shepherd named Kelly, who was sitting quietly on a rock minding his sheep. The boys came up a rise behind him, and they picked him off with one shot from a rifle. They then rode down and robbed his corpse of the only thing of value they could find on it, his watch and chain. After 2 more days of this chaos, every able-bodied man in the district had joined the posse that finally cornered them in this lonely cabin near Douglas Lake and threatened to burn them out. They'd stolen enough guns and ammunition for an army, and they drove back a couple of the posse's attempts to set fire to the shack. In the end, though, all the Avengers had to do was wait. The wild McLeans had forgotten to take in any food. Before hunger broke them, they sent out a defiant note with a postscript that might give a psychiatrist food for thought.
Mr. Clapperton, sir. The boys say they will not surrender, so you can burn the house down 1,000 times over. It was signed by Alex Hare, and there was a P.S. at the bottom of the note, which read, "I wish to know what it is you all have against me. If you have anything, please let me know what it is." The 3 McLean boys and Alex Hare were found guilty of capital murder and were hung in 1881 on January the 31st at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Rode by, rode through here, 3 McLean boys and that wild Alex Hare. They were armed, all were armed. It was them, I'd have known them anywhere. Willie Palmer's stallion was no $20 cayuse, and when the wild bunch stole him, he hightailed it into town. Usher in those days was keeping order in the district, but before he'd ridden 30 miles, the McLean boys shot him down. Oh, rode by, rode through here, 3 McLean boys and that wild Alex Hare. A shepherd known as Kelly saw the wild bunch as they passed. They shot him with a rifle and they took his watch and chain. When the posse found them, they were in a lonely cabin. Hunger took their fight away and no one else was slain. Oh, rode by, rode through here, 3 McLean boys and that wild Alex Hare. They hung the boys in January in 1881. The first time in that province they'd strung up brothers 3. Their son killed 19 Germans across the seas back in 17. One thing that's for damn sure, they're a wild old family. Oh, rode by, rode through here, 3 McLean boys and that wild Alex Hare. They were armed, all were armed. It was them, I'd have known them anywhere.
Ian Tyson takes us on the trail of another McLean when Telescope 67 returns to the bad men of BC right after this message.
It was 7 o'clock in the morning in the little mining town of New Hazelton in northern BC. Nobody was really up and doing yet, so there didn't seem to be any explanation for the unholy clamor emanating from the bank. person on the streets was the Reverend Donald Redmond McLean, the local Anglican minister. No relation to the Weil McLeans. It didn't take him long to figure out what was going on, and before anybody else could make the scene, he decided what to do about it. It was 6 American bank robbers who figured on leaving town with the entire life savings of every family in New Hazelton, and the Reverend had something to say about that. By the time he'd disposed of 2 of the bad men, the town had been roused. And as he reloaded his trusty Winchester, a couple of other citizens had found good positions, and the situation was well covered. Three down. How many more to come? And were they going to shoot back? Sorry, the bar is closed. And so is the dentist. It looked as if the next desperado was going to try and make it with the strongbox. Jackpot. 5 down, 1 to go. In the time it takes to boil an egg, as the townspeople used to say afterwards, the Reverend Donald McLean had almost single-handedly cleaned up the notorious Russian gang, who'd come up from the U.S. for some easy pickings north of the line. This true story was one of the few Western-style gunfights in Canadian history. It took all kinds of men, and men who could do all kinds of things, to open up the Canadian West. While the townsfolk of New Hazelton cleared up the mess and got their money back in the bank, the Reverend Donald McLean went home to polish up his sermon.
It was less than 50 years ago when a man who called himself George Edwards bought himself a small ranch at Aspen Grove and settled in. He fitted into the community right away. He was a kind and gentle man, and he only had to hear about someone in trouble to be on the spot trying to help them, and often the help was cash. He could handle horses well, and he was a good cobbler. He could play the fiddle, and it just wasn't a party without good old George Edwards. So it came as a real shock when they found out that he wasn't really good old George Edwards at all. He was Bill Miner, the famous train robber. And they might never have known if he hadn't come out of honorable retirement at the age of 60 to pull one last job. The first train robbery in Canada's history. It may have been that his many kindnesses to his friends had bitten too deeply into George's life savings.
Whatever it was, nobody could believe it. It was just too hard to credit that good old George Edwards was not really good old George Edwards at all, but the famous train robber Billy Miner. It was just down the track a ways from the CPR station here at Ducks that they boarded the train. It makes you think when you realize that Miner was 60 years old when he pulled this job. He boarded the train near Mission Junction and had the engineer bring the train to a halt so smoothly that none of the passengers were wakened. His 2 partners were Shorty Dunn and Jim Calhoun, and the train slid to a stop a few feet from where they were hidden. Everything went according to plan. Shorty and Jim swung into the baggage car with a charge of dynamite to blow up the strongbox. It was the first train robbery in Canada's history, and they got clean away with $6,000 worth of gold dust and nuggets and $1,000 worth of negotiable bonds. Bill Miner went back into retirement, and if he'd stayed there, we wouldn't have been able to tell you this story today. But somehow he couldn't resist, and he tried it again 2 years later. This time, one of his partners panicked under the routine questioning of the Northwest Mounted Police, who didn't even suspect them, and the jig was up. It was a terrific story. It made headlines all over the world. And during the trial, the court was flooded with testimonials to George Edwards' fine character. But they'd caught him red-handed, so they had to convict him, and Billy Miner went to the pen. A year later, he escaped to the United States, and the evidence seems to prove that a lot of people must have helped him, like maybe half the population of BC. But whether they were helping Bill Miner, the outlaw, or George Edwards, the good neighbor, who knows?
George Edwards could preach and fiddle and sing. The fashion's some new shoes for you. He'll give you $1 when you ain't got a dime. What more can a good neighbor do, boys? What more can a good neighbor do? And Bill Miner rides the ridges where the trains come rolling through Mission Junction down along the CB line. He's stolen all the gold dust and $1,000 too, and he's off again and running through the pines. George Edwards once told me when I was a lad, if a man prays, be thankful he prayed, and respect his religion, though it may not be yours. For all folks have different ways, boy. For all folks have different ways. And Bill Miner rides the ridges where the trains come rolling through Mission Junction down along the CB line. He's stolen all the gold dust and $1,000 too. He's off again and running through the pines. George Edwards is gone and carried to trial. The crown would not grant him his bail. Had I blasting powder, I'd blow up and free George loose from the Ocala jail, boy. George loose from the Ocala jail. And Bill Miner rides the ridges where the trains come rolling through Mission Junction down along the CB line. He's stolen all the gold dust and $1,000 too. He's off again and running through the pines.
Until next week, Fletcher Markle for Telescope 67.
I'm a rambler, I'm a gambler, I'm a long way from my home. If you people don't like me, just leave me alone. For it's dark and it's a-raining, and the moon gives no light, and my pony can hardly travel on this dark road at night.
Telescope 67.